I was sitting at my parents' dinner table, laughing at my dad's terrible jokes, when my phone buzzed. The message I read made my blood run cold. GETUPANDLAAVE. Don't say anything to your parents. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. This is a story about betrayal, secrets, and the kind of revenge that serves justice on a silver platter. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Revenge with Amanda, where we dive into the most shocking tales of justice served cold. I'm Amanda, and if you're new here, this channel is all about real stories of people who refused to be victims and instead chose to fight back. Today's story will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family loyalty. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you love stories about karma catching up with the right people, and ring the notification bell because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming up on this channel. Now, let's get into today's story, because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely wild. Our story comes from Jessica, a 28-year-old marketing executive who thought she had the perfect family. Jessica grew up in what seemed like a picture-perfect household loving parents, a successful father who owned a small but thriving construction company, and a mother who worked as a nurse. They lived in a beautiful suburban home, took family vacations every year, and from the outside, everything looked absolutely ideal. Jessica had always been close to her parents, especially her mother, Rebecca. They talked almost every day, shared secrets, and Rebecca had always been Jessica's biggest supporter through college, career changes, and relationship ups and downs. Her father, David, was the stereotypical strong, silent type, a hard-working man who provided for his family and never missed a family dinner. But here's the thing about perfect families: sometimes they're perfect because someone is working very hard to keep the imperfections hidden. Sarah had been dating Jake for about 2 years. Jake was everything her parents seemed to approve of: stable job, good family background, respectful, and genuinely kind. Her parents loved him, always invited him to family gatherings. And Lisa had even started dropping hints about marriage and grandchildren. What Sarah didn't know was that Jake had been getting a very strange feeling about her family for months. See, Jake worked in digital forensics for a cybersecurity company, which meant he was naturally observant and had a talent for noticing things that didn't quite add up. It started with small things. Tyler noticed that Jessica's father, David, always seemed nervous around him, but not in the typical protective dad way. It was more like guilt. David would avoid eye contact, change the subject quickly if Tyler asked about his work, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable whenever Tyler was around. Then there were the phone calls. Tyler started noticing that Rebecca would get these phone calls during family gatherings, calls that would make her face go pale before she'd excuse herself to another room. When she'd come back, she'd be distracted for the rest of the evening. David was on the phone in the garage, and Tyler heard him say, "Look, she can never know about this. If Jessica finds out what we did to her real parents, it will destroy everything." Then there was a pause, and David continued, "The adoption agency promised all records would be sealed. How is this even possible?" Tyler stood there in shock. Jessica had never mentioned being adopted. In fact, she looked remarkably similar to both her parents and had always talked about inherited traits, family medical history, and childhood stories that seemed to place her firmly in this family from birth. Tyler was faced with an impossible decision. Should he tell Jessica what he'd overheard? Should he investigate further? Should he confront her parents? He decided to do some digging first, and what he found was going to shatter everything Jessica believed about her life. Tyler's background in digital forensics gave him access to resources most people don't have. He started with public records, and immediately, things didn't add up. Jessica's birth certificate showed her parents as David and Rebecca. But when Tyler dug deeper into hospital records and cross-referenced dates, he found discrepancies that made his stomach turn. The birth certificate had been issued when Jessica was 3 years old, not at birth. That's a red flag in any forensics investigation. Tyler then started looking into adoption records, and while most were sealed, he found something that changed everything. There had been a car accident 25 years ago. A young couple, Michael and Patricia Thompson, had been killed by a drunk driver when their 3-year-old daughter survived with minor injuries. The accident report showed that the drunk driver was David Jessica's father. But it gets worse. Much worse. Tyler discovered that David had not only killed Jessica's real parents, but he had used his connections. His brother worked for child services to cover up the adoption process. Instead of going to jail for vehicular manslaughter, David had somehow managed to adopt the daughter of the people he had killed. Rebecca, Jessica's mother, had been David's girlfriend at the time and was apparently in on the entire scheme. They had literally stolen the life of the child whose parents they had destroyed, and they had been living this lie for 25 years. Tyler was sitting on information that would destroy the woman he loved, but he also knew that Jessica was living with the people who had murdered her real parents and stolen her entire identity. The moral weight of this secret was crushing him. Tyler spent weeks trying to figure out how to handle this. He gathered evidence, documented everything, and finally decided that Jessica deserved to know the truth. But he also realized that this needed to be handled very carefully. If David and Rebecca had been willing to cover up a vehicular homicide and adoption fraud for 25 years, there was no telling what they might do if they felt cornered. Which brings us to that fateful family dinner. Sarah had invited Jake over for her mother's famous lasagna, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Mike was telling stories about work. Lisa was asking Sarah about her latest marketing campaign, and Jake was sitting there knowing that he was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of this family. Jake had made a decision. He was going to tell Sarah everything after dinner. But first, he wanted to see if he could get Mike or Lisa to slip up, to say something that might make the revelation easier. So he started asking seemingly innocent questions about Sarah's childhood, her baby photos, family medical history. The more Jake probed, the more nervous Mike became. Lisa kept shooting warning glances at her husband, and the atmosphere in the room started to shift. Sarah noticed something was off, but couldn't put her finger on what it was. Then Jake made a comment that changed everything. He said, "It's amazing how much Sarah looks like both of you." People always say adopted kids sometimes grow to resemble their adoptive parents, but this is remarkable. The room went dead silent. Mike's fork clattered to his plate. Lisa's face went white as a sheet, and Sarah looked confused, asking, "What do you mean, adopted kids?" That's when Jake realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had revealed that he knew something without thinking through the consequences. Mike stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward, and the look in his eyes was pure panic mixed with rage. Mike started toward Jake, and Jake realized that this situation was about to become dangerous. He quickly pulled out his phone and sent Sarah that text, "GETUPANDLA. Don't say anything to your parents." Sarah's phone buzzed just as Mike was demanding to know what Jake thought he was doing. Sarah looked at the message, looked at Jake's face, and something in his expression told her this was deadly serious. Without saying a word, she stood up and walked toward the door. Mike shouted, "Sit down, Sarah! We need to talk about this." But Jake was already moving, grabbing Sarah's hand and heading for the exit. Lisa was crying, begging them to stay, saying they could explain everything. But Jake knew that once they started explaining, Sarah would be in even more danger. If Mike had covered up vehicular homicide once, there was no predicting what he might do to protect his secret now. They got to Jake's car and drove away, leaving Sarah's parents standing in their driveway. Jake drove to a nearby park and sat Sarah down on a bench. With shaking hands, he pulled out a folder containing everything he had discovered. He started with the hardest truth. "Sarah, The people you think are your parents killed your real parents 25 years ago." Sarah's reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Disbelief, anger, confusion, and then a devastating kind of heartbreak as Jake walked her through every piece of evidence. The birth certificate discrepancy, the accident report, the sealed adoption records he had managed to access, the timeline that showed Mike had adopted her just months after killing her real parents. As the truth sank in, Sarah realized that her entire life had been built on the gravestone of her real parents. Every birthday celebration, every "I love you," every moment of what she thought was genuine family love had been tainted by this horrible secret. But here's where Sarah showed the strength that makes this story so powerful. Instead of falling apart completely, instead of running away or pretending she never learned the truth, Sarah made a decision that would bring justice for her real parents and consequences for the people who had stolen her life. Sarah spent 3 days in a hotel room with Jake, going through every piece of evidence and planning her next move. She wasn't just angry, she was strategically furious. She realized that Mike and Lisa had not only murdered her parents and stolen her identity, but they had also defrauded the government, falsified legal documents, and probably committed dozens of other crimes in the process. Sarah's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. She was going to give Mike and Lisa exactly what they deserved, but she was going to do it legally and thoroughly. No shortcuts, no vigilante justice, just pure, systematic consequences for 25 years of lies. First, Sarah contacted the detective who had originally worked her parents' case. Detective Rodriguez was now close to retirement, but when Sarah explained who she was and what she had discovered, he immediately agreed to reopen the investigation. It turned out that Rodriguez had always suspected there was more to Mike's story, but he had never been able to prove it. Next, Sarah reached out to a lawyer who specialized in adoption fraud. When the lawyer heard Sarah's story and saw Jake's evidence, she agreed to take the case pro bono. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice for a crime that had been covered up for decades. But Sarah also did something that showed incredible strength. She hired a private investigator to find any remaining family members of her real parents. She discovered that her father David had a sister living in Arizona, and her mother Maria had elderly parents who had never stopped grieving their daughter and had never known what happened to their granddaughter. The reunion with her real family was emotional beyond words. Sarah's aunt immediately saw the resemblance to her brother David, and Sarah's grandparents wept when they realized their granddaughter was alive and had been living just 2 states away for 25 years. Armed with family support, legal representation, and overwhelming evidence, Sarah was ready to bring down the house of lies that Mike and Lisa had built. But she wanted to do it in a way that would expose them completely and ensure they faced consequences for every single crime they had committed. Sarah's plan was to confront Mike and Lisa one final time. But this time, she would be wearing a wire for the police, and Detective Rodriguez would be listening from a van outside. The goal was to get them to confess on tape, which would make the prosecution's case airtight. Sarah called Lisa and asked to meet at their house to talk about what happened. Lisa was desperate to fix things and immediately agreed. When Sarah arrived, both Mike and Lisa were there, and they had clearly been planning their own strategy for damage control. What Mike and Lisa didn't realize was that their desperation would be their downfall. The moment Sarah started asking questions, they began trying to justify their actions. Mike actually said, "We gave you a better life than you would have had in foster care. Your real parents were young and struggling financially. We saved you." Lisa went even further, admitting that they had known the adoption was fraudulent, but convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. She said, "We loved you from the moment we brought you home. It doesn't matter how it happened, you're our daughter." That's when Sarah dropped the bomb. She told them she knew everything about the drunk driving, about Mike's brother facilitating the illegal adoption, about the falsified documents, about the 25 years of lies. Mike's reaction was to become angry and defensive, which only made him confess to even more details while the police recorded every word. Detective Rodriguez and his team entered the house just as Mike was threatening to make sure this never goes to court. The look on Mike and Lisa's faces when they realized they had been recorded confessing to multiple felonies was absolutely priceless. Mike was arrested for vehicular manslaughter, adoption fraud, falsifying government documents, and conspiracy. Lisa was arrested for conspiracy, adoption fraud, and accessory after the fact. Mike's brother at Child Services was arrested later that day for facilitating fraudulent adoptions. The case made national news. Mike was sentenced to 15 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter and the additional fraud charges. Lisa received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy. Mike's brother lost his job and received 5 years probation plus community service. For Sarah, the legal victory was just the beginning of a long healing process. She had to rebuild her entire sense of identity while grieving parents she never got to know and processing the betrayal of people she had loved for 25 years. But she also gained something beautiful, a connection to her real family. Sarah's aunt became like a second mother to her, sharing stories about David and Maria that helped Sarah understand where she came from. Her grandparents, despite their age, became doting grandparents who had 25 years of love to make up for. Sarah also filed a civil lawsuit against Mike and Lisa for damages, fraud, and emotional distress. While they had lost most of their assets to legal fees, Sarah was awarded their house and what remained of Mike's construction business. But more importantly, she used the civil case to ensure that every detail of their crimes became public record. The case also led to investigations into the Child Services Department where Mike's brother had worked. Several other questionable adoptions were reviewed, and new protocols were put in place to prevent this kind of fraud from happening again. Sarah's relationship with Jake grew stronger through this ordeal. He had risked everything to tell her the truth, and his support throughout the legal process proved that sometimes the right person will fight for justice alongside you. They're now engaged and planning a wedding where Sarah's real family will walk her down the aisle. But perhaps the most powerful part of Sarah's story is what she did with her experience. She started a nonprofit organization that helps adopted children access their real birth records and assists families who suspect adoption fraud. She's turned her personal tragedy into a mission to help others. Sarah also created a memorial for her real parents, David and Maria Santos. Every year on the anniversary of their death, she visits their grave with her aunt and grandparents. It's her way of honoring the people whose lives were cut short and ensuring their memory lives on. Mike and Lisa thought they could bury their crime along with Sarah's real parents. They thought that time and love would somehow erase the evil they had done. But justice has a way of surfacing, even after 25 years. Sarah's story teaches us that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the deepest betrayals. But it also shows us that the truth has power. When we choose justice over comfort, when we choose difficult truths over convenient lies, we honor not just ourselves, but everyone who has been wronged. And that's today's story of revenge, served with a side of justice. Sarah could have chosen to keep quiet, to protect the only family she had ever known, even after learning the horrible truth. Instead, she chose to honor her real parents and ensure that Mike and Lisa faced consequences for their crimes. Sometimes revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making sure the truth comes to light and that justice is served. Even when it's painful, even when it costs us everything we thought we knew about our lives. What do you think about Sarah's choice? Was she right to expose Mike and Lisa, even though it meant losing the only family she had ever known? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts on these stories. If you enjoyed today's story, make sure to subscribe to Revenge with Amanda for more incredible tales of justice and karma. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and check out the playlist of my most popular revenge stories if you want to binge watch some serious justice being served. Remember, everyone sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the truth comes to light. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep fighting for what's right. And don't forget to check out these other amazing revenge stories that will absolutely blow your mind.